Good afternoon. Welcome to the Korea Society. Thank you for coming today, and for those tuning in either through live streaming or through YouTube podcast or audio podcast, we welcome you as well. Today we are discussing a very pressing issue. The Korea Society has now mounted upwards of 10 programs on North Korean human rights in the last 2 years, and we are so delighted today to have such an esteemed panel. This at the urging 2 weeks ago of the Asan Institute, which has produced a very important companion report, as it were, or follow-on slavery and forced labor, looking beyond the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report. So we are grateful to Asan, its president, its staff, and to people like Elaine and Stephanie who have brought us here today. And I'd like to begin by noting our two distinguished speakers, Shin Jong-hoon, who is a research fellow and the director of the Center for Global Governance at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, as well as Go Mong-kyun, who is a research fellow in the Risk Information and Social Policy Program in the Center for Public Opinion and Quantitative Research at Asan. And they have produced what many of us in the community feel is a really invaluable report that we would urge you to consider through their presentation and to try to obtain hard copy or electronic copy of, and we do have hard copy here for distribution today. They bring in issues of labor and slavery in very important ways. And so I turn it over to you, and then we will move to our distinguished discussants.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Noraper, for providing us this wonderful facility and the logistics. I am Chang-won Shin, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. And let me begin with, first of all, the structure of the report. Well, actually, this report consists of two parts. The first part is the summary of the United Nations COI report. And the second part is we are dealing with slavery and forced labor. If I tell you the summary of the gist of the UN COI report, we have found three key findings and three key recommendations. Amongst three key findings, the first finding is that North Korea is a totalitarian state. And the second key finding is that North Korea human rights violation has amounted to crimes against humanity, and North Korea has committed the crimes against humanity and other gross, widespread, and systematic violations of human rights as a matter of state policy. And the third finding is that the supreme leader of North Korea sits at the top of the system, and the COI designated 6 government organs as having committed the crimes and the violations under the effective control of the supreme leader. Based upon these three key findings, what the COI report is talking about key recommendations is that, first, the UN COI recommendations are based upon 3 pillars, so-called 3 pillars of the responsibility to protect. The first pillar is that the primary responsibility of North Korean regime to protect its people. And the second pillar is related to the international community's responsibility to assist capacity building of North Korea in promoting human rights situations. And the third pillar is related to coercive measures, such as referring the situation to international criminal justice and targeted sanctions. However, if we look into the significance of the UN COI report, actually the function of UN COI is fact-finding commission. So we can say that the COI report is kind of springboard for raising the human rights issues or milestone on the road to the promotion of human rights situation in North Korea. But when it comes to the reaction from North Korea after the release of the UN COI report, it is very interesting in the sense that the reaction from North Korea to the series of the efforts made by international community, I think it is doubtful that the current regime has any political will or capacity to improve its human rights situation. What has puzzled us so far when it comes to the reaction from North Korea is that North Korea seems to consider even the universal value of human rights as negotiable and politically compromised. For instance, North Korea has threatened us to, for instance, to conduct the fourth nuclear weapon test, or even they are mentioning nuclear warfares against United States and South Korea. So this is a clear evidence that North Korea considers the universal value of human rights as negotiable, politically negotiable, or politically bargained. However, North Korea has always blatantly challenged and criticized the United Nations COI report for two reasons. For instance, firstly, they are arguing that the commissions have not, the members of the commissions have not investigated the crimes and violations on the scene, on the spot. But we should bear in mind that it was the North Korea regime that has not allowed the commissioners to enter North Korea to investigate on the scene. And secondly, they are always arguing the human rights issues in the UN COI report is domestic matter. So they think it is unacceptable intervention. Anyway, the Asan Institute is trying to, seek a certain solutions that can overcome the challenges and criticism from North Korea. Well, actually, the answer may be found from the recommendations of the UN COI report, but our team at the Asan Institute has decided to go beyond the UN COI report and the mandate of the UN COI. Firstly, seeking practical and implementable solution, and secondly, raising more international matter like slavery and forced labor issues. So what would be the practical and implementable solution to rebuffing the North Korea's challenges to underestimate the value of the UN COI report? We have decided to find, firstly, the cases where the investigation can be conducted without North Korea's prior consent, and secondly, the cases that are international matters like abduction in the UN COI report. As you may know, under current international law, it would be really difficult to bring any justice to the states like North Korea that has not ratified key international human rights treaties. The only treaty that North Korea has ratified is the ICCPR. However, there are some areas where jus cogens, peremptory norm may apply. Amongst them, there is prohibition of slavery, labor. That is why our team has decided to research on the slavery and forced labor. Surprisingly, we found 45 states have had the employment scheme for North Korean workers so far. The infographics of page 28 and 29 show you the hosting country profiles. As of 2013 January, 50,000 workers were employed in 16 countries. Very conservative approach to the number of the workers. Our team conducted interviews with North Korean defectors who had experience, who had worked in foreign countries. After the interviews, we concluded 10 findings. I do not go into the details on the 10 findings, but above all of these findings, interestingly, most of the contract was concluded by North Korean state enterprise as one of the contracting parties. Particularly in case of Russia and Mongolia, in order to export its labor, there was government arrangements or memorandum. I think this report raises the issue of workers' rights. We have to be we would like to put emphasis on this aspect because North Korea has campaigned to its people that North Korea is the paradise of workers. However, North Korea is not a member of the International Labor Organization, a representative champion of the workers' rights. The research on slavery and forced labor issue will be a test for the combination of human rights issues, human rights perspectives, and workers' rights perspectives. However, when it comes to the sanctions, with regard to the sanctions, Dr. Goh will be more detailed. But with regard to the sanctions, we think, we have to apply very cautious approaches because workers abroad from North Korea will be window opportunity to, for training North Koreans the value of democracy and workers' rights. So we need very cautious approach. So we are not asking the hosting states to, stop immediately the program, the employment program, but to apply international labor standards at the stage of the conclusion of the contracts between North Korean state, enterprise and the hosting government. And we sincerely hope, we sincerely like the hosting states to regularize the monitoring of workplaces by local authorities and interview with workers without, in the absence of North Korean administrators. So microphone will be to Dr. Goh in order to talk about the human rights and sanctions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shin, and thanks again to Korea Society for organizing this important event, despite the fact that this is pretty much the start of the holiday weekend. But, my apologies for that, for coming at the wrong time, maybe. So, as Dr. Shin mentioned, I'll be talking briefly about the sanctions regime and our motivation behind the focusing on the forced labor scheme and forced labor export scheme by North Korean regime. Before going into that a little bit, I wanted to let you know that there's been a little bit of a controversy regarding the on part of our report, which it's the number of, actually not the number, but the figure, the amount of money that North Korean regime makes from this labor export scheme. Despite the fact that we quoted this number from another existing research, if you check the report, we quote this figure of around the $1.2 billion to $2.3 billion a year that the regime makes from this scheme. We quoted that number just to give the readers a certain idea about the scale of the labor export scheme. Most important part, however, for our research was to determine the number of victims of this forced labor scheme, and we are very confident about the number instead. But going back, wanted to clarify that our research into the amount of income that North Korean regime makes, we have to be publicly clear about it. We think, to our estimate, that the North Korean regime makes between sort of baseline, between $400 million a year to $500 million a year, and that's exclusively simply from the wage confiscation that the regime practices on its workers. We ended up with this number by multiplying the number of workers who are working abroad, and with the number of average wages that these workers receive at the market rate of each one of the host countries, and then we take out a percentage cut that the regime takes away from this income. So we are going to actually release more a detailed research into this number later on. So what I wanted to be upfront about is that our own number into the size of the income that North Korean regime makes from this export scheme is much, much less than the independent research that we quoted in this report. So let me go back to the sanctions. So the reason why we focused on the human rights ground for sanctioning North Korea is because we think we consider the current sanctions regime to be quite specific and narrow, focused too much on the non-proliferation issues. We have here an actual expert for the sanctions regime, William Newcomb. But then let me just actually be a little bit transgressive and say that the regime is too narrowly focused on the non-proliferation activities. So there are all these instruments that the international community applies to prevent the proliferation of WMDs by North Korea, such as listing the number of individuals and entities that bet non-proliferation activities, as well as targeting these individuals and entities by applying tool sets such as travel ban and asset freezes. But the problem is the individuals and entities identified in the sanctions regime is way too short. There are only like a couple of dozens of individuals and entities, targeted in these regimes. And as well as because of the nature of the North Korean regime as an isolated state, there's little that we can do to target other areas. As you know, North Korea doesn't have much problem in furthering its WMD programs. That's an evidence that the current regime is not working out. So we actually had to brainstorm carefully about which other areas we could target to punish North Korea for its misbehavior. And we came up with 3 important criteria to identify these areas. We came up with the condition that these areas should be important policy-wise, meaning that the regime has to feel the pain from the sanctions. Also, whatever sanctions measures we come up with have to be implementable. Meaning, one of the key recommendations of the COI report is that the international community suggests the international community to take Kim Jong-un to ICC, the International Criminal Court. But if you think about the implementability of such a suggestion, I think the actual implementability is pretty low. So we had to think about the implementability, as well as we wanted these sanctions measures to have an immediate effect, immediate impact in improving the conditions of the North Korean people. So that's how we came up with the area of forced labor, because first of all, the forced labor is an outlet for the regime to make money, because the illicit trade by the North Korean regime, which constituted an important source of income, has been dwindling down because the effectiveness of paradoxically speaking, the effectiveness of the sanctions regime in place. It targets the illicit trade in missile parts and weapons, as well as illicit trade in counterfeit money and drugs. So according to some of the research, for example, by Marcus Noland and Stephen Haggard, North Korea used to make in the tune of between $300 million to $500 million a year from this illicit trade in the 90s, but that figure has dwindled down to around $100 million. So in comparison, North Korean regime, to our estimate, is making between $400 million to $500 million a year. So it's an important loophole that we have to target to make sure that the regime cannot finance, especially the WMD programs, and continue, of course, the human rights violations. And another problem is that by allowing this North Korea's labor export scheme to continue, we are actually violating important UN sanctions on the transfer of bulk cash. Because of the financial sanctions applied against the regime cannot wire its earnings abroad back to North Korea using the traditional banking system. So what they are doing is that they are using the workers who are repatriated after the term of their contract back to North Korea as couriers. So they are using bulk cash in order to transfer the money back to North Korea. So we should target that important loophole as well. So finally, we think it's about time that we include sanctions measures against forced labor scheme to make sure that we come out with a very comprehensive sanctions regime against North Korea. And for that, we suggest that the international community, as well as the U.S., to come up with actually, for example, for the U.S., we recommend the U.S. Congress and the executive branch to pass a comprehensive bill such as the H.R. 1771 as soon as possible. And we suggest the international community to use its existing mechanisms such as the ILO court to target the violations of the labor rights in the hosting countries. So this way I wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Dr. Go, Dr. Shin, thank you very much. It's now a delight to move to our esteemed panelist, and I'll just briefly note that we have Dr. Sue Terry here back with us. She was just with us for a discussion of her remarkably influential foreign affairs piece, and she's back today in her capacity with both Columbia University and Gearson Global Advisors. Sue has worked with the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the National Intelligence Council, and we are delighted to have her here today. David Hawk, a singular expert, especially on human rights issues relative to Cambodia and North Korea, with decades of experience, and a noted author as well as former executive director of Amnesty International USA. Pampreet Singh, who you may have just heard making comments on the historic vote last week, 111 to 19 in the United Nations General Assembly, well known in the media and senior counsel in the International Justice Program for Human Rights Watch. And she has also worked notably on issues of Bosnia, the DRC, and Cote d'Ivoire. And William Newcomb, who has been noted, is a singular expert on sanctions. Bill was just with us talking about sanctions at the Korea Society. We're delighted to have him back, and a long history in public service, both with the State Department and Treasury, and with the UN experts panel, and a real insider's knowledge of sanctions, how they work and how they don't, and where opportunities may lie. Sue, might we begin with you?
Sure. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Korea Society and Stephen for holding this very important session. And thank you to the Asan Institute and for not only producing this very interesting report, but also bringing such a beautiful warm weather to New York City, because it was bloody freezing here before you got here. So thank you for that. We have serious experts on this panel, sanctions experts, human rights experts. So I will leave it up to them to get into all the details. So I would like to just make some broad comments, particularly because, from having watched North Korea closely from U.S. government's perspective, having spent some time in the intelligence world and in the policy world, and having experienced the tremendous frustration they came with quite ineffective policy. I think we can all agree that our policy towards North Korea has not been successful for past 2 decades. So from that respect, I would like to just make a few comments. And considering the failure of our policy towards North Korea, I'm actually quite delighted, to be very candid with you, just the recent development in general of human rights issue, human rights violations that's going on in North Korea, finally seeing light of the day in recent days. And I think for too long, U.S. policy towards North Korea and the world's policy, world's North Korea policy, has been overly focused on this denuclearization piece, and not enough on human rights issue, and that human rights has always taken backseat. Even though we had a Human Rights Act, even though we paid a lot of lip service to human rights has always taken the backseat. And we now all know, I think we can agree, that this very myopic focus on the denuclearization, just a nuclear issue, has not turned out well thus far. North Korea is still obviously a growing threat, and it has been an ineffective policy, I would argue. So now, along with this landmark UN report that has been released earlier this year, and the recent UNGA veto resolution, the vetoes from China and Russia, we'll get into that, but it has successfully passed. And now with that, international community is finally paying some attention to this very widespread and systemic gross violations that's going on in North Korea. And to augment that COI report, now we have this Asan report that you guys have just produced, that Dr. Shin and Dr. Go just talked about, that raises yet other aspects of the human rights violations that's going on in North Korea that we should be paying attention to, particularly abuses that are suffered by the ordinary North Koreans sent to overseas abroad as forced laborers, and the North Koreans that are working in the nuclear facilities. And I think the report, when you just read over the report, it really illustrates how, to a very large extent, the entire state of North Korea is like one large, as you said, it was a totalitarian state, so it's a large prison, slave state. And as someone who really believes that, as Korea watchers and all of us, we can't talk enough about North Korea's human rights issues. So I really welcome this report. That's just my way of saying I really welcome this report. because it gives us yet another opportunity like this to gather together and to talk about human rights issues. And the one that's particularly the one that has not been mentioned within the COI report on the ordinary citizens. I do have to admit that out of the two groups that are mentioned, I do find the forced laborers as a group is a little bit more compelling, just because I think we need to do a little bit more research and we need to just on the North Koreans and nuclear facilities. And also because I say that because I think more concrete, as you said, more concrete and practicable and implementable solution can be found with the first case. So I just mentioned that. Regarding the policy recommendations, I agree in large with the report's conclusion and the recommendation that as an international community, what we need to do is to continue to apply pressure against on the regime and even expand our pressure to the regime, particularly in the form of expanded sanctions. So I'm very interested in what Bill has to say. I do think that contrary to popular opinion that North Korea's sanctions has been maxed out, they have not been maxed out. For example, there are no sanctions against any human rights violators, right? Like, I believe it's like in Sudan and Iran and Belarus, there are sanctions in place for that. We don't have that. There's also no broad-based third-party sanctions against North Korea's exports or the financial sector, like Iran or in Myanmar, Burma, which are designated as the primary money laundering concern under the Section 311 of the Patriot Act, which then restricts their access to global financial system. So I do agree with the report's recommendation that the U.S. needs to adopt, and we need to adopt more comprehensive sanctions against North Korea that's modeled on, I think you pointed out, the 2012 Iran threat reduction, the Syria Human Rights Act. I think the report points that out. In light of UN report and studies such as this Asan report that just came out, targeting sanctions against North Korea should definitely include the aspects of the human rights violations and violators. I've been advocating, and I also noticed it on the report, that as a first measure, we need to adopt the 2014 North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act, which is House Resolution 1771, which will be an important first step towards that end. And let's see where we can go with that. We all remember Banco del Sahel sanctions of 2005. At the time, it was true that I do think that Kim Jong-un truly felt, North Korea felt this international isolation, financial isolation. I think, one of the North Korean diplomats even told the U.S. diplomat that you really found a way to hurt us. And since then, we did not have that kind of leverage. And I think combined with right now what we're the pressure that North Korea has been feeling on the human rights front, and they have been feeling it. This is why they've been running around all over town, right? They even trying to defend their human rights record. They really didn't want the passage of that UNJ resolution. So this has been an unexpected sort of leverage. Besides the fact that it's the right thing to do, it also has been an unexpected leverage against North Korea. So when you have that, and you're now adding on enhanced financial sanctions, as suggested by this report, on top of the ongoing human rights efforts, I think this is when you really think about when you say what's practicable and implementable, that's the only way. I mean, I can't even think of any other thing that we could possibly do to get at North Korea. And this kind of financial pressure was, I believe, the reason why we are talking about Iran right now. That brought Iran to the negotiating table. I understand that talk has been postponed or is ongoing, but that's one of the reasons why Iran came to the table. So we all know, as I mentioned from the beginning of my comments, that diplomacy and trying to talk to North Koreans, six-party format, bilateral format for 2 decades of various diplomacy have not worked. It has failed to curb North Korea's nuclear program, nuclear threat. So the regime must be given a choice, a very, very, very clear choice between changing its ways in some degree or internal collapse at some point. I know people, that's not a popular term and people like don't want to talk about it, but it has to be given the very, very clear choice. So again, I defer to Bill and others who are expert on sanctions to comment the feasibility of more expansive and comprehensive sanctions. But I definitely want to advocate that. But I do have a couple questions for you guys. One has to do with Russia and China. The report talks about, in addition to adopting more comprehensive sanctions, how international community we need to pressure countries that make use of North Korea's laborers to enforce basic standards, right? To should apply international labor standards. And out of 16 countries that made use of North Korean forced laborers last year, of course, China and Russia hosted the most. Russia, I noticed, hosted some 20,000. And China hosted 19,000, right? So, okay, we might be able to put pressure on countries like Kuwait, who had 5,000, UAE, 2,000, Qatar, 1,800, Mongolia, 1,300, and so on, and other countries are much smaller. But it's really China and Russia that are hosting bulk of them. But as you know, even that's why I said earlier, China and Russia even vetoed against this resolution and probably will at the UNSC. So how do we get Russia and China to do this? I mean, because you can get all other countries to work on this, but if Russia and China does not get on board, we're not really getting anywhere. So that's my first question. I wonder if you can comment on that. And so as a practical matter, Russia and China piece concerns me. The second question that I wanted to ask both of you is about the Kaesong Industrial Complex, and how do you work around this with your own South Korean government? Because Kaesong Industrial Complex is one other major source of hard currency, as you know, for North Korea. So if you're really arguing this, as you are, I would like for you to sort of present this dilemma we have with the Kaesong Industrial Complex, and how is the South Korean government receiving your report? I would be interested in your response to that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. David.
I have a general comment or two, and then a little question, and I had 5 bigger questions, one of which on the KIC, Sumi has already asked. But just to note at the beginning, we're not at all beyond the COI at this point. There will be another vote at the General Assembly the week of December 15, and then we very much hope that the Security Council will take up North Korea human rights situation in the last 2 weeks in December, because the Security Council will change in January. And some countries that are actively hostile to pursuing human rights issues at the Security Council or anywhere are coming on in January. So we hope. So in that sense, we're not beyond it. But your report is actually quite timely. At the Human Rights Council in March, the original EU draft did not mention sanctions. And France and the U.S. went to one of the open sponsors meetings. And importantly, since they are on the Security Council, they introduced targeted sanctions into the resolution that the Third Committee has passed, and the GA will also pass overwhelmingly the week of the 15th. So that's very timely. I also found this is the most comprehensive thing I've read on forced labor abroad by North Koreans. So that's very valuable. So thank you for doing that. And I also really liked your little, what do you call them, infographic. That chart, that's great. I hope they publish that in the newspapers, because it really says so much in that little chart. Now, my little questions. What is it that North Korean labor does in Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos, which is mentioned on page 26? I've lived several years in two of those countries, and I wonder what in the world what they are doing there, other than being waitresses in the North Korean restaurant. Bigger questions. The report mentions that $120 to $150 per month is what is provided for or to the North Korean workers, but that the contract, this is only 10 to 20% of what the hirers of the contract labor are paying to the government. So obviously they're getting 80 to 90, the government's getting 80 to 90% of this, but I was still struck by the $120 to $150 figure. And I wonder, in calculated in dollar terms, what does a North Korean teacher make per month? Or a farm laborer, or a miner, or a policeman? I just have no idea. Sounded to me like a fair amount of money, but I have no idea. So it would be interesting to know the comparative wage structure. Second question, mentioned in the report, 6 of the 15 UN sanctions currently in place have some sort of human rights mention or component. I didn't know that, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, if you or if Bill can tell us a little bit more about it. I wonder, thirdly, are you talking to the Sanctions Committee while you're here in New York? My fourth question was about whether or not, if the South Korean government could be persuaded to hire workers directly rather than through the state agency, if there isn't the idea that that would be the end of the KIC, because of the unlikelihood that North Korea would allow South Korean companies to pay North Korean workers directly. So that's and then lastly, there was a note on page 36 that discussions on human rights with North Korea are not likely to yield productive results. Since having there hasn't been and there isn't any dialogue with North Korea on human rights, it's one of the things that human rights advocates advocate, and it's in fact inserted into the GA resolution. I suspect you may well be correct in what the report says, but since there's no practice to cite, to my knowledge, other than 2 preliminary meetings with the EU in the early part of the new millennium, because the Sunshine people didn't raise it. The Americans talking about human rights, but haven't in some of their bilateral meetings, but haven't actually had the discussions yet. I wonder on what basis you express your doubt that there would that this would yield any productive results? Those are my 5 questions for the presenters, or perhaps Bill.
No pressure.
And we'll get to those in a minute. Thank you, David. Pam.
Well, thank you very much for hosting this very interesting panel. I also found the report very interesting. I mean, I agree with what David said, that we're not quite beyond the COI, but I do think it's a helpful anchor in terms of how to further the discussion about human rights practices in North Korea outside of what the COI report has found. I mean, as was mentioned, I work in the International Justice Program at Human Rights Watch. So you can imagine I was particularly interested by one of the key recommendations of the COI report, which was referral to the ICC. I mean, first, that there was even a finding that there were crimes against humanity. Second, that they were pursuant to policies at the highest level of the state. And third, that this was the inevitable conclusion that there had to be accountability. And in fact, this is something that has figured prominently in the Special Rapporteur's briefing as well, both in Geneva and New York, that the international community can't turn away any longer from this question of accountability. One question that I've often, so basically since the COI report has been issued, I've been engaged in a lot of advocacy with states, both on and off the Security Council, to really flesh out, what can be done? How can we continue to raise the political cost of inaction on North Korea? And, I think what we saw is that we had this groundbreaking Commission of Inquiry report. Its methodology was wildly applauded as being unassailable. But now what? Now what do we do? How do we keep the pressure on? Because North Korea isn't like Syria. I mean, you don't have, ready access to images. Doesn't feature prominently in newscasts. So how do we keep up this pressure with this 400+ page report? Our strategy has really been on 2 tracks. I mean, we mentioned the UN General Assembly, and that really has been a key avenue for us as an advocacy organization to really galvanize the voice of the international community and, send a signal that we can't afford not to do anything on North Korea any longer. So we focused a lot on, the General Assembly vote, as has been mentioned. We're very happy with the results of last week. 111 states in favor, only 19 states voting no. But one question that I've confronted time and again is why bother? I mean, yes, one of the key features of the General Assembly resolution is that it makes explicit reference to the Security Council and urging it to consider referral to the International Criminal Court. And, as I said, a question I often get is, well, why bother? I think there are a lot of reasons to bother. First of all, I think what we've seen is the prospect of accountability has really galvanized a response by the North Korean regime. I mean, I've spoken to a number of diplomats, and I think anyone here would probably agree that we've seen more engagement by North Korea. In fact, I think Sue made this point earlier. We've seen more engagement by North Korea in Geneva and in New York in the last 7 months than we have in the last decade. So clearly, they're very sensitive to any criticism of their human rights record, and the fact that they could be potentially held accountable in the International Criminal Court. That was the key pressure point, I think, in the GA. And we saw precisely this in a number of ways in the lead up to the vote of the resolution. First, we had the North Korean regime, potentially dangling the possibility of allowing the Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in North Korea to visit the country. I mean, this is the first time this offer was made in the, 10+ years since the mandate was created. Clearly accounted, and in exchange for the deletion of the 2 key paragraphs in the General Assembly resolution. One, the fact that crimes against humanity were committed pursuant to the highest levels of the state, and second, the fact that the Security Council should consider referral to the ICC. I mean, clearly they care very deeply, not just about their human rights record, but the fact that they could be held accountable for it. So I think that demonstrates why accountability is so important with respect to North Korea. Another question that I've often received, and I'm sure is on everyone's mind, is, well, what's the point? Will China ever allow it? Probably not. And to that, I would say, yes, of course, China has an interest in maintaining practical reasons for maintaining the status quo. I mean, they don't want a flood of refugees over their border, and they want to maintain the state such that it is. But I would also respond and say that there are factors outside of, the status quo that could actually change their minds. I mean, it's not unprecedented that China would allow a referral to the ICC to move forward. We saw that with Darfur, and we saw that with Libya. And, there is a possibility of some external factor. For instance, perhaps another nuclear test. I think we heard at the General Assembly resolution last week, North Korea threatening to conduct another test in response to the passage of the resolution. I'm not an expert on China-North Korea relations, but many have told me, and perhaps Sue or David can speak to this, that the relationship between China and North Korea may be close, but it is not warm. And I think that there may be some possibilities, however potentially remote at this stage, but possibilities, I think, created by the Commission of Inquiry report and possibilities created by raising the political cost of inaction on North Korea that could potentially be used to persuade China down the road to consider ICC referral. Another question that I've had is, even if ICC referral happens, there's no prospect for enforcement. You're looking at a regime that doesn't travel. What's the point of indicting these people if you can't really arrest them tomorrow? Well, to that I would say, as I said before, North Korea cares very deeply about its reputation. An ICC indictment would really crystallize, I think, the international community's condemnation of the practices that it's engaged in that have resulted in crimes against humanity. It could potentially change the behavior of mid-level perpetrators, for instance, in the camps, to perhaps be less abusive. It could also persuade North Korea, short of regime change, that's something that obviously is distasteful to many. I think, that could start the road to changing practices within the country. So it's a shift in policy, a shift in behavior, a managed transition, if you will. But I also think it's just from a point of principle, the question of accountability is essential to send the message that accountability is not going to go away. It may be politically inconvenient, but at the end of the day, we're talking about, potentially hundreds of thousands of victims. They deserve accountability. They deserve justice. And the international community should stand by them. And that's certainly a message we sent to many states in our advocacy in persuading them, trying to persuade them to vote yes for the GA resolution. And that brings me to this current report, which I actually found really helpful. Especially the point about forced labor overseas, because I think it helps put a much needed spotlight on other governments in terms of, so it's not just the focus is not solely on the North Korean regime and its abusive policies, but also those governments that facilitate those repressive policies on which, there may be more traction. Perhaps, as Sue pointed out, not China and Russia immediately, but there are a number of other states that frankly should know better and could be useful to put pressure on them, as the report rightly notes, in the context of the Human Rights Council through the Universal Periodic Review process, and also, the various international labor treaties. I guess I would just add, outside of, the focus has been solely on the International Criminal Court and what it can or cannot do. I would say longer term, I know and I think it's right that the immediate focus is really, putting pressure on those states that facilitate this forced labor to change their practices and frankly hit North Korea where it hurts in the pocketbook. This is a valuable source of income. And I see it as being, potentially, as effective as sanctions in a way, because these are relationships that North Korea actually cares about. But over the longer term, I guess it depends on how effective that strategy is in terms of that sort of pressure through these various avenues in Geneva and elsewhere. There are other prospects for criminal justice. One is in those states where, that are facilitating this forced labor, or slavery, essentially. Looking at their criminal justice statutes to see if they have anti-slavery anti-slavery provisions that could be enforced in those countries, or alternatively, or in addition to that, looking at third-party states, either through universal jurisdiction, so it doesn't matter the nationality of either the perpetrator or the victim. Some crimes are just so heinous that any state can take jurisdiction over prosecuting them, or if those statutes don't exist in third-party states, to look and see where potential defendants are dual nationals, because of course a state can take jurisdiction over its own nationals if they commit criminal behavior. So that's just something to think about over the much longer term. But in short, I did find the report very helpful and certainly gives us something useful to work with here in New York. I guess I would echo the question that David asked in terms of what your plans are in terms of following up both on the sanctions side, but just generally your broader strategy to raise the cost for those states who are doing business with North Korea. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bill.
Well, I want to thank the Asan Foundation for the invitation to come and participate in this, as well as the Korea Society for hosting. And to the authors, I want to commend you because you've produced a very forthright statement that extends the findings of the COI and illuminates the broader human rights violations inflicted upon North Korean workers by its leaders. And you formulated some pretty bold proposals to be considered by the international community. Now, I've had some questions thrown my way during the context of this, and I'm going to address the sanctions issues, but I want to put it in a little bit of a broader context first. And the reason is, if you go back and you look at Security Council Resolution 1718 from 2006, the language of that. Well, what's the objective of the resolution? It's to put North Korea back in the NPT. It's very clearly stated. Mm-hmm. What's the method? One of the cited methods is through diplomacy, particularly through six-party talks. So let me use this as a device. So let's dial back the clock to the time of six-party talks, which is a few years back. And the approach taken by the U.S. and others towards the DPRK elevated concerns over nuclear issues above all else, the very point that Sue had made, including human rights. Within the context of talks, not only were human rights concerns viewed as diversionary to accomplishing the objective of getting the DPRK back in the NPT, many participants shared an assumption that even should it be raised, little likely would be accomplished, and moreover, that aggressively tackling this issue would at a minimum spoil the atmosphere and more likely either stall progress or derail the talks altogether. Now, that's my personal opinion, but I think I could probably find others that would concur with that. Now, I have my own views about whether these tactical choices were the right ones, but I don't have any special expertise on human rights. I'm an economist, not a lawyer. I'm truly not even a sanctions expert per se, just a practitioner. But since I don't have it, I've always tried to find experts and see what they say about things. And so the timing of this meeting today is really propitious. This past Wednesday, to mark the 25th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, a human rights champion was honored in Washington, and his bust was unveiled in National Statuary Hall adjacent to the Capitol Rotunda. So this is what Václav Havel had to say on the question of six-party talks and human rights, and I'm going to quote this. And this is from 2008. For too long, too many in the international community have refused to address North Korea's flagrant human rights abuses for fear that their criticisms would drive the government away from discussions of its nuclear program. However, time has shown that this restraint has not yielded enhanced compromise from Kim Jong-il, but has only allowed him to ignore his own people's suffering. The world cannot continue to postpone discussion of these critical issues. We owe it to the people of North Korea to finally take action to alleviate their misery. This was in an op-ed published in the Boston Globe on that date. Mm-hmm. Now, both the report of the Committee of Inquiry and the report we're discussing today, which extrapolates from it, were foreshadowed by two reports that Havel and others sponsored, both on failure to protect. One was in 2006 and one was in 2008, and David may have had a hand in one or both of those reports, I believe. Now, I raise this particular point because I'm a little concerned that DPRK blustering about a fourth nuclear test could trigger a repetition of this particular cycle, a drive toward having talks restarted, and a coincident diminished focus on human rights as a result, a dampening of pressure that has been applied to try to end its abuses and address international concerns. And if so, I suspect the risk is great that the momentum that's being generated today by the COI report and the recent vote would be lost. So that's why I focused on this particular thing. And we face a dangerous period of months in the future. Now, the report we're discussing today similarly asserts, and again, it was picked up by an earlier comment, that seeking to engage DPRK on human rights, and I'll quote, will lead virtually nowhere. And so it calls for the international community to face up to a very difficult challenge of devising and implemented targeted sanctions that are a regime based upon human rights. And this, of course, is in line with the Secretary General's 2009 report on responsibility to protect. And I don't believe it was quoted in your report, although you reference it, but another nice quote. I usually don't do this, but this was too good an opportunity. While sanctions may be inadequate to stop abuses by a determined authoritarian regime, if applied sufficiently early, they can demonstrate the international community's commitment to meeting its collective responsibilities and serve as a warning of possible tougher measures if the violence against a population persists. So I think, again, this kind of underscores that there is an absolute need, at least, to pursue this. Now, let me move on to what I was actually brought here to talk about, and that's the sanctions recommendations. So I'm going to divide my comments into several groups on the recommendations. And I've structured these in the order that I see feasibility. And the first is to improve enforcement of existing sanctions. And in the context of this, it's bulk cash. Now, bulk cash, the prohibition on bulk cash is first noted in Resolution 2087 and expanded upon in Resolution 2094, both of which were adopted in 2013. The first time finance gets mentioned at all was back in 2009, and that was on financial services. So bulk cash was an attempt to plug a loophole because it was being used as a way to help evade the sanctions. And in 2094, the operating paragraph begins with decides. In UN speak, there is no ambiguity about decides. I mean, it is an instruction to the member states. And the threshold for action by a member state is set very low because it's if it could contribute to these prohibited programs. You don't have to prove it does contribute. All you have to do is believe that it could contribute to prohibited programs, and then the member state is compelled to act. And it acts, the authority it has is to block the transaction, to freeze the funds. And not only was this mentioned in paragraph 11 of that resolution, it was reinforced in paragraph 14, which again is relatively unprecedented to take a particular topic and repeat it in a different way, where it calls upon, not quite as strong a language, member states to ensure that they are preventing these kinds of transactions. Now, that's well and good, but anyone who's looked at UN sanctions or has heard me speak before knows that only half of UN member states have implemented sanctions. And that's a problem. And so this is the other thing that can be done, is to try and improve capacity. One of the interesting parts of HR 1771 is the sense of Congress measure at the bottom, which says that the United States should work to increase member state capacity. And so I think that all member states that are interested in seeing an improved implementation of sanctions need to work with the capacity challenge states and those who lack political will to see if you can gin it up. So the next thing is to put pressure on the countries and companies that are employing North Korean labor. Russia, China, little chance of that. The lumber agreement is longstanding. It's been there forever. It involves a share of lumber. The workers go in and out. They live in a concentration camp existence. Every now and then you get somebody escape. But I don't see that too much is going to be done there. On the other hand, I think you can set clear standards. I think you can put pressure on the countries and companies that are employing them elsewhere. I think you can confront them with reputational risk in terms of how they treat the workers. I think you can convey to these countries best practices. And also, if they're not paying their workers very much, that means when they go bid for a construction contract in the UAE, they're underbidding competitors who are abiding by labor standards. So you're engaging in unfair competition. So I would encourage you to also go and talk to the companies that are competing with Jinko and other North Korean construction companies for these projects, so that they also put pressure on the vendors to make sure that you have a level playing field. So I think all of this can be done. I think name and shame actually has benefit. And where possible, use the courts to try to enforce local laws. Find somebody who has standing and have them bring a case. And try to get countries to adopt appropriate regulatory measures and then enforce them. So I think a lot can be done in going to the places where the workers are employed and trying to improve their lot. Enhanced sanctions. That's the third one. Let's start with the Security Council sanctions. Now, most of these sanctions are taken under Chapter 7, either explicitly or they reference the Security Council's duty to ensure international peace. And so they will not necessarily cite Chapter 7, but they'll use the language from the introduction of Chapter 7. If we take a look at an analog of what you're proposing, let's look at Libya from the Resolution 1970 from 2011. That is under Chapter 7. It mixes the targeted financial sanctions. It has human rights elements. It has other kinds of elements. It has non-proliferation elements and so forth. So it's a pretty good model of what this kind of resolution might look like if you were able to get it accepted in the case of DPRK. But I think we all know there's scant prospect of getting this adopted by the Security Council. However, if accepted, let's say the Security Council passes a resolution and it incorporates it. Well, first, the resolution is going to be administered by the 1718 Committee. And the 1718 Committee has a record of being a very tough place to get designations. Even of admitted, very visible offenders of the resolutions, it's still tough to get designations because designations are a political act. They're not a result of an offense. Mm-hmm. Second, I want to urge you to be careful what you wish for. Because you were talking about adding to the list of prohibited items, those that would be crowd control or surveillance and things of that sort, and including small arms. Well, 1718 has an exemption. It's called small arms and light weapons. And the committee has to be notified 5 days before such a transaction takes place. And so of all the trade in military weapons that's prohibited, trade in small arms and light weapons is not. So if you want to go in and add that to the list, then you're reopening some settled negotiations. And if somebody reopens negotiation on this issue, it's not a stretch to think that negotiations might be reopened on other settled issues. So, as I say, be careful what you wish for. And I think there are some very hard-won fights that are reflected in the resolutions, particularly in 2094. Now, if it's accomplished, you potentially have a much greater impact than you would have ever achieved under autonomous sanctions, because under Chapter 7, all member states, whether they implement it or not, are required to enforce it. So it could be powerful, but again, likelihood very low. Autonomous sanctions. US, EU are okay. Japan, you left off Canada. And others have the potential for doing this. And even under the UN Act, member states have a flexibility to designate companies and individuals that are working on behalf of other designated entities. So you have all of that. I view it as a second best approach because it doesn't have the universality of effect, but it may be the only way, and you'll get a much better hearing in capitals. If so, I encourage you to encourage them on transparency. Because too often we find visa denials programs don't tell you whose visa is being denied. We have asset freezes. They're not reported to anybody. We have other kinds of travel bans. And by the way, travel bans are not only the individual, but his family members, which sort of makes him a little more sensitive to it if he wants to send his kid overseas to go to school or something. So encourage transparency, make it visible who's being targeted, and in the context of transparency, make very certain that the reason they're being designated is provided in compelling detail so that everybody knows what they did and why they're on this particular list as an individual or as a firm. And finally, I think everyone needs to review every government needs to review their current policies and practices, especially in the area of finance. Japan needs to look at its remittance practice with North Korea. And I'll bring up Kaesong again. North and South Korea do not consider that they engage in international trade, so they don't report the statistics. Yet, they pay the workers in Kaesong in US dollars rather than won, which mystifies me. And it's sent there as bulk cash. So I have some intellectual problems with that. I understand that you're not likely to get it fixed. There are certain issues with Mount Kumgang. Mount Kumgang, if there is a bulk cache, since that is coming now after 2094 is adopted, it would be very much dancing on the edge of the resolutions in a sympathetic interpretation. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our discussants. We'd like to really offer a hats off to Human Rights Watch for all of its advocacy, especially with the historic vote last week, and also thank the Asan Institute for its wonderful work, its distribution of this report. And it has an excellent website. For those of you who might not have visited, please do, because you'll find a lot of current affairs as well as information on security and diplomacy at the Asan site. I'd like to thank Stephanie, to Elaine Block, and Nikita Desai, who's back with us today, and our interns. It's a wonderful contribution from our staff here. And thank you for joining us, especially with quick notice. Enjoy this Thanksgiving week, and it's been a very rich and informative session. And let's hope that this is just further momentum, especially as we head into December, as David pointed out, and further action. Thank you all for coming to the Korea Society.